Friends, I welcome you to my channel. Before listening to this story, I will ask you to like and subscribe. It is not difficult for you, but it is pleasant for me. And we're starting. Dan Kinner took a sip of bourbon and picked up his iPhone. He received a message from his wife saying that she would be late at work again and that he had to have dinner himself. Dan was a man who loved to plan. Since the evening was free, Dan decided to eat a cheeseburger at Whataburger and spend the evening with Lee Child's latest novel Jack Reacher and a bottle of 13-year-old Millam and green bourbon, given to him by his father-in-law. He was saving the bottle until the right moment, and this evening promised to be such a moment. Dan took another sip of bourbon and put the iPad down on the end table, enjoying the amber liquid with a strength of 111 proof, 63.5% alcohol by volume, and reflecting on his current situation. Kendall, Dan's wife of 6 years, has been working overtime for the last 6 months. At the beginning of the marriage, they agreed to put an equal amount into a common checking account every month to pay bills and finance vacations, but personal savings, checking and retirement accounts were kept completely separate, and neither of them had access to each other's accounts. Kendall's income as an employee did not increase due to additional hours, so regardless of whether Kendall worked 40 hours a week or 60, her income remained the same. With separate personal accounts, Dan didn't know if Kendall earned little or much from her overtime hours. The amount that each of them contributed to the joint account was much more than was required to cover expenses, and the balance of funds increased significantly. Kendall insisted on this division of accounts even before their wedding. When he and Kendall first met, Dan's business was struggling due to the poor economy, and there were weeks and months when Dan refused to pay himself. This is a feature of the business. The cleaner gets paid earlier than you. Dan refused to fire employees and dug more and more into his personal savings to keep the promise he made to himself that no one would lose their jobs. He went through life step by step, and at nightfall he closed his workshops, and all he found was that he was getting another day older and even deeper in debt. Kendall earned a decent salary as a full-time accountant at a Fortune 500 company and stayed out of Dan's business. She was afraid that his company would collapse at this time, and kept her at arm's length. During these difficult years, Dan lived off savings so as not to burden Kendall, and although it was sometimes difficult for him to fulfill his obligations to replenish their shared account, he could always put his share on it, knowing that the storm would eventually pass. Dan was able not only to survive the storm, but also to succeed. The collection of 3 car repair shops that he inherited from his father has turned into a small network of 12 outlets over the past few years. In the next 3 years, he acquired land options, which will increase the network to 20 points. All the workshops were operating at a disadvantage, but Dan deliberately kept his salary as low as possible and invested the profits back into the business. Tire fitting equipment was purchased for each point, capable of installing and balancing tires of any size on any type of wheels, regardless of their exoticism. Modern diagnostic equipment allowed his technicians to diagnose and fix handling problems in almost all cars produced in North America, Asia, and Europe, except France, because to hell with a bunch of Peugeot cars. So, Dan's business was in full swing. Kendall's work was going well. This was supposed to be the happiest time of their lives. But there were cracks in their marriage. It was a second marriage for Dan and Kendall. Dan's first wife died when she was hit by an elderly female driver while doing her usual morning jog. It was a clear, sunny morning with a slight October chill in the air. Because of the morning glare, an elderly woman driving to her doctor did not notice Kendall running down the street. The city authorities were repairing a damaged culvert, as a result of which the sidewalk was destroyed, and Lizzie had to run along the roadway for about 20 feet, 6.3 meters. That was all that was needed. 20 damn feet, 5 seconds of running, and 2 lives cut short. Lizzie didn't know about it yet, but she was 4 weeks pregnant when she was hit by a car. This was the second case of tragedy in the Kinner family. Dan's mother died of lung cancer when he was in high school. She had never smoked a cigarette in her life when she started coughing persistently and sought medical help. 8 weeks after the diagnosis, she was gone. It took several months before Dan could begin to recover from Lizzie's death. His father appointed an acting manager in the workshop, which was run by Dan. It gave Dan time to grieve for his wife and the child he would never have. Dan might never have come to his senses if his father hadn't had a fatal attack of coronary insufficiency when he was driving home from his workshop in the evening. This made Dan forget about his pain and focus on business. People's livelihoods depended on him. It was because of a careless accident that Dan met Kendall. The mechanic's apprentice removed the radiator cap without waiting for the engine to cool down as Dan passed by. Hot antifreeze splashed out on Dan's chest, and he had to go to the emergency room. The waiting area of the emergency department was crowded with visitors, which can be found in most cities. Open head wounds, overdoses, withdrawal syndromes, and a range of injuries and injuries characteristic of what ambulance staff called BRIs, from the abbreviation beer-related injuries. The seat next to Dan was empty, and Dan himself did not look intimidating, although he looked as if he had been doused with some kind of greenish liquid with a smell that was weak and unpleasant at the same time. A tall, attractive brunette limped over to Dan and sat down in the empty seat next to him. Since there were a lot of people in the emergency room, they knew they would have to wait. They told each other about their injuries. Kendall twisted her ankle while jogging after work and briefly talked about their lives. There was an immediate attraction between Dan and Kendall. Dan invited her to dinner, and she agreed. They became friends and became a couple very quickly. Kendall divorced her first husband because of his emotional abuse and infidelity and told Dan from the first date that she does not tolerate cheaters. They got married 15 months after they met. Dan took a sip of whiskey and thought about his marriage. What did the old joke say? We have been happily married for 5 years now. Unfortunately, we got married 6 years ago. For the first few years of their marriage, Dan and Kendall were ecstatically happy. They were laughing together. They were dancing. They were constantly making love. They had a good time together. The problems began after Kendall received her MBA, a master's degree in management, and was lured from the bank where she got a job after college to work as an accountant for a Fortune 500 corporation, for which she now worked. Dan supported her. He wanted Kendall to be happy and successful. The moment came when one of the senior vice presidents had to retire, and the senior director, to whom she reported, applied for this position. The position of senior director remained vacant, and Kendall felt that she had a very good chance of promotion. She just needed to show that she really wanted the job. A few months later, Dan noticed that Kendall had become unhappy with him. Everything he did didn't seem right to her. Kendall began to disdain his work. To her, he was just a mechanic now. A monkey in grease, the nickname of car mechanics. She began to disparage him during every conversation. Her constant anger and irritation at her husband brought discord into their marriage. Kendall started working overtime to stay away from Dan. When she was at home, she was texting on her phone. Her phone number. God, he hated her phone. She was always on the phone. She secretly laughed at the incoming messages. She turned the screen so that her husband could not see who she was texting with and what these messages were about. I slept with my phone under my pillow. And then everything turned violent. Kendall has always had a short temper and quickly flew into a rage. This usually resulted in a sharp remark or a sharp barb at the object of her anger. She always calmed down and corrected herself quickly when her temper got out of control and when Dan became the object of her anger. However, Dan noticed that her outbursts of temper had become more frequent and more prolonged, which in the past had made her temper somewhat bearable. A month ago, during an argument that Kendall started for no good reason, she slapped him in the face. In 6 years of marriage, neither Dan nor Kendall have ever raised a hand against each other. But she slapped him, and it shook Dan to the core. The slap surprised Kendall too, because she immediately apologized and asked for forgiveness. But then there was the incident with the coffee cup. A week after the slap, Kendall yelled at Dan because the oil change light on her BMW lit up and he didn't change it. Dan explained to Kendall, for the umpteenth time, that her BMW was serviced for free for the first 3 years, so there was no point in changing the oil if the BMW dealer did it for free. Kendall yelled at Dan, "Just change the oil, asshole." Dan had had enough of this nonsense. "I told you not to buy this car, but you just had to have this overpriced and unreliable piece of German shit. Now that you have it, you have to serve it yourself. You will sign up for service at a BMW dealer yourself. That's your concern." Kendall was furious. She picked up the coffee cup and threw it at Dan's head. If he hadn't dodged, the phone would have hit him right in the forehead. He stared at Kendall in shock. She gave him an expressionless look, then turned on her heel and left without saying a word. Dan took another sip of whiskey. He heard the garage door open, signaling Kendall's return home. Dan picked up his cell phone and sent a message, as well as an email, which he queued up. They were duplicates, sent to the same person and contained the same package of information. So it didn't matter which one was received first, or if one of them didn't get through. Dan was a firm believer in backup plans. As Tennessee Ernie Ford sang a long time ago, if the right one doesn't get you, the left one will. As Kendall walked through the living room, she glanced at Dan, who was comfortably ensconced in an overstuffed armchair with a glass of whiskey in his hand. I'm going to change my clothes, and then I need to ask you about the strange activity on the joint account. Kendall didn't wait for Dan's reaction to her statement and headed for the bedroom. A few minutes later, Dan heard the shower turn on. Both Dan and Kendall have set up notifications about unusual activity in their banking apps. Dan received the same text notifications that Kendall undoubtedly worried about. He sighed, took a sip of bourbon and put the iPad aside, waiting for Kendall to return. She returned 15 minutes later, dressed in black yoga pants and a white t-shirt that exposed her stomach, and sat down on the couch opposite Dan. Her wet hair was pulled back from the shower, and although she hadn't put on any makeup, she was a stunningly beautiful woman. Her body was slim and athletic, topped with a chest with a C cup, which, at the moment, was not burdened with a bra. "Do you know about these deductions from the joint account?" "What is it?" she asked. There was a slight accusatory tone in her voice. She handed Dan her cell phone. Their bank's application was open to check the activity of their joint checking account. The balance was $12, while the day before, it showed more than $30,000. Dan nodded his head. $12,000 deducted from the PDSC? This is Pendragon Security Consultants. This is to pay them for following you for a month and documenting your affair with your boss. 18,000 ACH, bank transfer via the ACH Alchemy Pay Network to the SKD account. This is a fee for Solomon, Klein and Davis, my divorce lawyers. He took a sip of his bourbon and watched Kendall's reaction. Tears welled up in her eyes, and her mouth opened and closed like a fish in water, trying to find oxygen. Her face turned red, and for a moment Kendall seemed speechless. Dan watched the emotions play across her face. Fear turned into sadness, which turned into anger, and then back into fear. She seemed stuck, and it wasn't until Dan lifted his glass to take a sip of bourbon that she seemed to decide what to say. "It didn't mean anything," Kendall said. "I just got involved in something I couldn't control. I'm going to end this right now. I don't want to get divorced." "Didn't you say that you don't tolerate cheaters? What did it mean to you?" "If you ever cheated on me, I would divorce you," Kendall said, looking at her hands clasped in her lap. "That sounds like a smart plan," Dan said. "I don't want a divorce," Kendall repeated. "What do you think was going to happen when I found out?" Dan asked. "I didn't think you'd find out," Kendall answered honestly. "I thought our affair would end and you and I would return to normal life. And disrespect? Anger and violence? Should I have just forgotten about it? I've never disrespected you. And there was no violence," Kendall said, her voice rising slightly as she denied Dan's accusations. "Did you make love to him in our bed?" Dan asked. Kendall gasped, and the blood drained from her face. "Yes," she said softly, "but I didn't mean to disrespect you." "Oh, well, that's all right then. If you didn't mean to disrespect me, then that's fine," Dan said with a hint of anger. "You made love to your lover in our marital bed, in our marital home, and you don't think it was disrespectful to me? And you're saying there was no violence?" Dan laughed sardonically. "You slapped me in the face and threw a coffee cup at my head. So yes, it was violence. We can overcome this." "I don't want to get divorced," Kendall insisted. "I'll make an appointment with a marriage counselor." Dan shook his head. "The problem was not in our marriage, but in your infidelity. I agree that counseling is necessary, but not to fix our marriage. You need to fix everything that's broken in you. If your boyfriend was single, you'd leave here on the first puff of a cigarette. He's not going to get divorced, so I'm your plan B." "I don't want to get divorced," Kendall repeated flatly. "You'll change your mind," Dan said with a sardonic smile. Kendall's phone buzzed with incoming notifications the entire time she and Dan were talking, but she ignored them, addressing Dan. When the incoming call came in, she looked down irritably. "You should probably answer that," Dan said. Kendall got up from the couch and headed to the master bedroom to get some privacy. While she was leaving, Dan picked up his phone, opened several applications, and pressed the send button. Dan could hear Kendall's muffled voice, but he couldn't understand her until she said loudly, "What did he do?" A few minutes later, Kendall returned to the living room. Her face was red, and her eyes were narrowed and angry. "Did you tell his wife? Did you tell his wife?" "Stop it," she screamed. "How dare you try to ruin his marriage? You have no right. They have 2 little boys. How could you hate her so much? You're a miserable asshole. You pathetic piece of shit. I will never forgive you for hurting her so much." Dan looked at Kendall, puzzled. "So you don't think he's a pathetic asshole for cheating on his wife? And I'm a miserable asshole for telling her that he's cheating? You have some kind of fucking logic, baby. Don't you think of yourself and your boyfriend as pathetic pieces of shit for lying and cheating on your spouses, and me as a bad guy for bringing this to light?" Dan shook his head and grinned. In his quest to understand what infidelity is, he recently read about the perverted logic of cheaters, but to see it on the example of his own wife was just madness. "This is between you and me. You had no right to interfere in their marriage," Kendall shouted, her face turning crimson with anger. "Your boyfriend had no problem interfering in my marriage, so I have no problem interfering in his marriage. If he is cheating on her with a colleague, then it is not known with which fools he is cheating. She must protect herself and get tested for sexually transmitted diseases. He's not like that, and he's clean. Since the first thing you do when you come home after working late is take a shower, I assume you're making love to him. You should take the test too." Kendall looked at her husband in shock. He had known about it for months, and he acted like everything was fine while he was hiring private detectives. Who was this man? You just wanted revenge. You're pathetic, Kendall said. Dan noticed again that her phone buzzed with incoming notifications, which she ignored while she hurled insults at him. When she paused to catch her breath, her phone rang. You should probably answer that, Dan repeated, taking another sip of bourbon. Kendall headed back to the master bedroom to answer the phone. Dan made a call on his iPhone and quickly mumbled into the phone. Then he opened the recording app on his iPhone and leaned it against the lamp that stood on the end table next to the chair. The phone was recording Dan's video, while the line remained open so that the other person could hear what was happening on the other end of the line. Dan sat leaning on his hands and waited for his wife to return. He didn't have to wait long. Kendall practically flew into the living room. You posted this on Facebook? Stop it, she screamed. Did you post this on Facebook and tag all my family and friends? Did you tag Pastor Riley? Well, yes, but to be fair, I also posted it on LinkedIn so that all your professional contacts could see it too. Kendall screamed in frustration and anger, and then threw her phone at Dan's head. He closed his eyes as she leaned back to throw and braced for the blow. When the blow came, it was much stronger than he had expected. He almost lost consciousness when the phone hit his forehead, but he managed to keep his composure. He knew that she was going to do something, and sitting still so as not to kill this fool was one of the most difficult things in his life. Kendall jumped over the space separating them and started hitting him in the face. Dan felt his lips split, and the coppery taste of blood gushed into his mouth. She punched him in the nose, and for a moment Dan's vision blurred. Finally, it got to the point where he stopped sitting, leaning on his hands, and covered his face with his hands while she continued to beat him. Kendall was screaming, I'm going to kill you, you bastard. I'm going to get a gun and blow your fucking head off. In the end, Dan stood up and took a few steps away, gently pushed her away, leaving the couch between him and Kendall. If the 911 operator that Dan called did everything right, then he will only have to wait a couple of minutes for the patrol car to arrive. That's exactly what happened. Kendall looked at Dan with eyes full of hatred. She was trying to figure out the best way to get to Dan. On the left? On the right? Over the top of the sofa? Before she could come up with a plan of attack, the doorbell rang. You should probably open the door, Dan said, his voice flat and emotionless. Kendall wrinkled her nose and narrowed her eyes, looking into Dan's eyes. She paused, then turned on her heel and headed for the front door. Kendall opened the door and 2 policemen stood in front of her. She talked to them, looking back at Dan every few sentences. The officers and Kendall were too far away for Dan to make out their slurred conversation. He saw Kendall gesticulating violently and pointing at him. Dan saw Kendall step aside and let the officers enter their house. She led one of the officers past the living room towards the kitchen. The second officer approached Dan. "Mr. Kinner, I'm Patrolman Diaz, and my partner is Patrolman Agnew. Your wife said that you were cruel to her tonight. Why don't you tell me what's going on? Did you touch her?" Dan shook his head. "No. I confronted my wife because of her affair. She attacked me." Dan pointed at his face. He could feel the blood on his face from the impact of the thrown cell phone. He also felt a split lip. "I'm the one who called 911. She's been aggressive lately. A month ago, she slapped me in the face, and a week later, she threw a coffee cup at my head. I dodged, but if it hadn't been for that, I would have had to go to the emergency room. I recorded today's confrontation. Would you like to watch a video?" Patrolman Diaz definitely wanted to watch the video. Dan made a few tapping movements on his iPhone and then handed the phone to the policeman. Patrolman Diaz silently watched the video, raising his eyebrows at the scene where Kendall lashes out at Dan. The policeman looked at Dan skeptically. "It looks like there was a conversation before the recording. Was there anything said that could have escalated the situation?" Dan shrugged his shoulders. "She found out that a private detective had been following her for a month and that I had passed on the results of the investigation to her lover's wife. She wasn't happy about it." The policeman chuckled. "You don't do everything by halves, do you? As one guy said, I light my way forward with the light of the bonfires of the bridges burning behind me." "All right, Dylan McKay." The officer shook his head and smiled. His partner came out of the kitchen and they conferred with each other. The second officer shook his head and nodded in Dan's direction. Patrolman Diaz played his partner a video on Dan's phone. His partner rolled his eyes and shook his head. Kendall's explanations were completely different, but she didn't know she was being recorded. Patrolman Diaz returned to Dan. "We are arresting your wife for domestic violence and terrorist threats. I suggest you issue a restraining order." Patrolman Diaz opened the front door while his partner led Kendall out of the kitchen with his hands cuffed. She was crying and starting to choke. "Dan, don't let them do this to me. Please, if you've ever loved me, make them let me go. I promise I'll be good." Dan rolled his eyes and turned to the officer, who handed him a business card. "My email address is on the card. Send me a copy of the video." When the patrol car drove away, Dan called his lawyer Dwight Solomon. "Everything went exactly as I expected. She was simply arrested and taken to prison. Stay calm, Dan. If she shows up tomorrow, you know what to do." The next morning, as Kendall was leaving the courthouse accompanied by her parents, she was stopped by a 20-year-old blonde chewing gum. "Excuse me," she said, stopping in Kendall's path. "Yes," Kendall Kinner replied, very tired, hungry, and annoyed. "Who are you?" "You've been served," the blonde replied, handing a shocked Kendall an envelope. The blonde smacked her gum and, turning her back on Kendall, left. "What kind of shit is this?" Kendall called out to the blonde's back. "I don't know. I don't care," the blonde replied over her shoulder. Kendall angrily opened the paper and saw the inscription, "Petition for Divorce." "That bastard," she shouted to her parents. It was a difficult morning. Kendall was woken up early and taken out of the prison cell, and then taken to a holding cell in another part of the building. She stayed in the cell for an hour before meeting with her lawyer. The night before, she was allowed to make one phone call, and she called her parents, who immediately began leaving voice messages at various law offices so that they could start work the next day. They signed a contract with the first lawyer, who called them back the next morning and received assurances that Kendall would be represented at the hearing. The judge set bail for Kendall in the amount of $10,000, which meant that she would either have to pay the entire amount or pay the guarantor 10% and then mortgage the property as collateral. The judge also issued a restraining order prohibiting her from contacting her husband, appearing at his house, or at his work. She had to arrange with her lawyer to get her things out of the house. Kendall's lawyer objected to this, but then he was shown photos of Kendall's husband. The objection was withdrawn. After leaving the courthouse, Kendall's parents first took her through the checkpoint to McDonald's. She was booked into the Denton County Jail too late to have dinner, and the jailers woke her up early for a morning court visit, so she skipped breakfast. Kendall hadn't had dinner the night before, preferring to spend time in bed with her boss Tony. She planned to snack on leftovers from the fridge when she got home, but that plan fell through. She wondered how she had ended up here. She and Tony had just finished the second round when the alarm on her phone rang. While Tony dozed next to her, she checked her phone, expecting to see a message from Dan. Instead, she saw a message from the bank about a low balance. She quickly logged into her bank's app and immediately saw that there were only a few dollars in the joint bank account. After lunch, 2 ACH withdrawals were credited to the account, one for $12,000, the other for $18,000. A Google search for payment recipients did not yield anything. Kendall understood that this could mean that they had been robbed or that the bank had made a mistake. Kendall was a smart woman. She also understood that this could mean that Dan knew about her affair and emptied the checking account. However, she didn't believe it. She knew her husband and knew that he was not afraid of confrontation. If he suspected her of cheating, he would definitely tell her. Dan Kenner was not the kind of man who would let such things pass by his ears. She knew that, and yet here she was, lying next to her boss in a cheap motel that was impressive in its mediocrity. Not for the first time, she wondered what she was doing here. Kendall always found everything easy. She was always the prettiest and smartest girl in the class. She was rarely the most popular because the other girls didn't trust her. At an early age, she learned to use her beauty as a weapon, and she took out these weapons without hesitation. It all started with Mr. Campbell, her high school math teacher. She had never dated high school students, only men who had graduated from college and had good jobs. College was a repeat of high school. If she had problems with her lessons, she made love to the professor. Both men and women wanted to use Kendall. She graduated from college in 4 years, earning a degree in finance. She thought about going to law school, but she knew she wasn't a strong enough student. For Kendall, her current affair with Tony Geyer, the senior director she reported to, meant nothing. It was a means to an end. It was during her second year at Chase Bank that she met Kyle Evans. Kyle visited her bank branch as part of an investigation into the possible money laundering activities of a suspected illicit drug dealer. Kyle was seconded to the Special Operations Division of the Denton County Sheriff's Department, and his long hair, mustache, and carefree attitude immediately soaked her panties. She brazenly invited him for a drink and climbed into bed with him at the end of their first date. 2 months later, they began to live together. A year later, they got married. For Kendall, married life was a revelation. She loved Kyle and wanted to do everything in her power to please him. Kendall and Kyle were perfect together. Until it's over. They had been married for 4 years and were actively trying to have a child. They haven't had any luck so far, but they've enjoyed trying. In the middle of the 4th year of their marriage, Kyle was offered a 4-week course organized by alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. Although he will be away for a month, having an ATF course on his resume will help Kyle with his promotion. It was not difficult to go. During the first week of Kyle's absence, Kendall was lonely, but good. The second week was a little more difficult, as hormones combined with loneliness increased her mood. By the end of the 3rd week, Kendall was already crawling on the walls. In the 4th week, Kendall agreed to go out for a drink with Bill Williams. William Williams, known as Bill Squared, or, more commonly, the Square, was her husband's former partner in the Denton County Sheriff's Department. Kendall didn't know exactly what led to their falling out, but she knew they weren't friends anymore. She accepted his invitation to drink with the vague idea that she could help overcome the differences. Besides, he was a handsome man, and she was lonely. What could be worse? Kyle showed excellent results in the ATF class. He was leading the class, which was very important because in the last week, the one who took the first place got the opportunity to take the final exam 3 days earlier. If they passed the exam, they could leave earlier, and if they failed, they had to stay until the end of classes. Kyle successfully passed the exam and 3 hours later was on a plane bound for DFW, Dallas, Fort Worth International Airport, to surprise his wife. It was 4 o'clock in the morning when Uber dropped Kyle off in front of his darkened house. In the driveway, he recognized the car of his former partner, the Square. Kyle's heart clenched into a cold fist as he unlocked the front door and entered the house he shared with Kendall. Leaving his suitcase at the front door, he quietly went into the bedroom. The room was partially illuminated by light from the main bathroom. The Square was lying naked on his back. Kendall was lying on her side, facing him, her arm draped over his chest. She slept with her husband in the same way. Kyle took out his phone and started filming the sleeping couple. After 30 seconds of shooting, He took several pictures and put the camera away. Then Kyle approached the bed from the square side, until tonight, from Kyle's side, and clasped his hands together, interlacing his fingers. Then he raised both hands above his head and brought them down with all his strength. The piercing scream that escaped from the mouth of the square woke Kendall from a dreamless sleep. When she woke up, she was scared and disoriented. She saw that Bill was crying and clutching his groin with both hands. She saw her husband standing over them, but for a moment her brain couldn't process what was happening. And then everything fell into place. Kendall was looking at her husband with a scared expression on her face. She slowly realized the horror of what was happening. Her husband looked down at her. His face was red with rage as he looked at his future ex-wife. "I'll be back at 3 to pick up my things. I'll be done by 6. Don't be here at this time. I won't be responsible for my actions if I see you, and you're not worth going to jail or losing your job." Kyle grabbed the square by the hair and lifted his face to look into his eyes. "You're a pathetic piece of shit. I'll send a copy of the video to your wife and the HR department. You can go and quit today because your career is over, as is your marriage." Kyle delivered a final blow to his nose, not hard enough to break it, but hard enough to make blood gush out. He turned on his heel and left the house, and Kendall sighed, remembering how much Kyle had been hurt by her cheating. Her strong husband was devastated, and she was afraid that he would never recover. He rejected all her attempts to contact him. He didn't want to see her or talk to her. The divorce took place, and her parents supported her, explaining that she was not to blame for anything. Kyle had to be very violent to cause Bill so much harm. His cruelty would sooner or later lead to the death of their marriage. Her story turned into a story of neglect and abuse on his part. Didn't he show his violent tendencies when he ran into Bill? As Kendall and her parents rewrote history, posing as a victim, she became the hero of her story. A brave girl who did what she had to do to escape from the brute that her husband had become. Only once were her fictions thrown in her face. Kendall was shopping at Engstrom's in Dallas when she came face to face with her ex-husband. There was a tall, slender woman with him. She had red hair and an athletic build. She seemed vaguely familiar. She was pushing a stroller. Kendall's eyes widened when she saw her ex-husband for the first time in 5 years. "Hi, Kyle," she stammered. "Hi, Kendall," he replied dispassionately. She held out her hand towards the woman. "Hi, I'm Kendall. I used to be married to Kyle." "Oh, yes. I've heard all about you," the woman replied, shaking Kendall's hand. Kendall blushed at that. "I'm sure it's not good. Something good. And some things are not very good," the woman replied. "I'm Corey Calloway. I'm Kyle's wife. This is our son, Kyle Jr." Kendall looked at the sleeping baby. The most difficult thing in her life was to keep a smile on her face while looking at her ex-husband's new family. "He's a wonderful child. You're lucky you married Kyle. He's a good man. It was good to see you again, Kyle." Kyle just looked at her contemptuously, took the woman by the hand and, pushing the stroller, headed to the men's department. A few days later, while watching the local evening news, Kendall was shocked to discover that the news anchor was the same woman she had seen with Kyle. That's why she seemed familiar to her. Kendall Googled Corey Calloway and discovered that she was a fast-growing media talent who might end up on one of the national cable news channels. Local media observers noted that although she is good enough, otherwise not necessarily slutty or boring enough, for Fox News, her intelligence is more suitable for MSNBC, although she will have to develop a more condescending tone if she moves to this channel. In the meantime, she was very popular in the local news. Kendall cried herself to sleep that night, and every night for the next week until she remembered her fiction. Kyle was violent and emotionally abusive, wasn't he? It was only a matter of time before his new marriage ended too. Kendall forced herself back to the present, thinking about what the divorce would mean for her. After eating an egg muffin, Kendall demanded that her parents take her to their home. "This is a bad idea, honey," her father said. "I need to talk to Dan. I have to explain to him what happened. We can work this out." "Ken," her mother began. "I don't think this is a good idea," the judge said. "I don't care what the judge said," Kendall snapped at her mother. "Just take me home." Kendall's parents walked her to the front door and watched her ring the doorbell. They stood and waited for a couple of minutes, and then Kendall rang the doorbell again. When nothing happened again, Kendall started banging on the door. Dan made a quick phone call and opened the door without removing the chain. You can't be here. There's a restraining order to keep you away. How can we fix our marriage if I'm not here? Dan looked at Kendall incredulously. Fix it? I'm divorcing you. We won't fix anything. I'm not going to stay married to a lying and cruel cheater. You need to get out of here. Dan closed the door, which infuriated Kendall, and she started banging on the front door. Let me in, you chicken shit bastard. You haven't seen violence yet until you see what I'm going to do to your cowardly ass. Open the door, right now. She started banging on the door furiously. Kendall's parents, seeing that their daughter was upset, also started banging on the door. As their daughter became more and more upset, their calls to Dan became louder and more emotional. Open the door, Dan, or I swear to God I'm going to kill you. I'm going to cut out your heart with a steak knife, Kendall screamed. Open the damn door, you fucking greased monkey. Kendall's father was yelling. I'll put you down, boy. Dan sipped his coffee and shook his head as he watched the video from the doorbell camera. He watched as the patrol car pulled into the driveway and as two officers approached the porch. The officers talked to the group for a minute, and then one of them separated and rang the doorbell. Dan opened the door and invited the officer in. After verifying Dan's identity, the officer asked him to tell his story. He noticed the cuts and bruises on Dan's face. Last night I ran into my wife because of her affair. I have proof of this connection because I hired a private investigator. During the confrontation, she raged and attacked me, Dan said, pointing to the bruises on his face. She was arrested last night and appeared in court this morning. She was given a restraining order prohibiting her from entering her house. Dan handed the officer a copy of the court order that the lawyer had emailed him. I have this too, Dan said, showing the officer his camera. He pressed the play button, and they watched a video of Kendall and her parents knocking on the door and threatening. The officer just shook his head, watching them. Well, it seems that everything is clear and understandable. Send me a copy of the video, the officer said, handing Dan a business card. He then turned on the microphone on his shoulder and requested 2 more cars for several arrests. Stay inside and watch this shitty show from your camera. Don't leave the house until I tell you. That's how it happened. The officer called his partner for a consultation. They watched the video on his phone and then approached Kendall and her parents, where they were informed that they had all been arrested for trespassing and terrorist threats, and that Kendall had been arrested for violating a restraining order. When 2 more patrol cars appeared, officers proceeded to arrest Kendall and her parents. Kendall's mother became hysterical, and Kendall began to cry and swear at the officers. Kendall's father tried to push the officers away to get to his wife and was knocked to the ground. A shitty show is an understatement. Dan called his lawyer and left a message. Kendall and both her parents have just been arrested. I think I married into a family of idiots. Leroy Keys felt defeated and depressed. He, his wife and daughter were arrested on Friday evening for trespassing and threatening their son-in-law. Since they were arrested on Friday evening, they stayed in jail all weekend, waiting to meet with the judge on Monday morning. Leroy and his wife have received restraining orders ordering them to stay away from Dan's home and business. In addition, Kendall's bail was revoked and she had to remain in jail for violating a protective order and making terrorist threats against Dan. Leroy and his wife Sarah managed to get out of prison, but Kendall will remain in prison for the foreseeable future. Deep down, he knew that he had failed in his role as a father in raising Kendall. She was spoiled, narcissistic, and maybe narcissistic, but at the same time, she was his little girl. His wife spent the weekend in the same cell with Kendall. Sarah didn't want to discuss what they were talking about, but when Sarah was released, she looked angry and determined. Leroy had no idea what it was about. Leroy called the lawyer he used when Kendall was first arrested. After explaining the situation to the lawyer, he sympathized with Larry, but he said that he was going on vacation and he would not be there. It was true, but at the same time it was a very lucky coincidence, because he thought the whole family was crazy and didn't want anything to do with them. Leroy flipped through the yellow pages, calling lawyers until he found someone who could see him right now. If Leroy had known anything about lawyers, that would have been the first alarm. Raleigh Cruz was not at all what a lawyer should look like. Thin, balding, with a hooked nose and small, narrow eyes, Raleigh more than vaguely resembled a buzzard sitting on a power line and waiting for its prey to die in order to pounce on the carcass. A vague phrase from a long-ago literature lesson popped up in Leroy's head. Something about a stingy and hungry look. Some ambulance hunters were advertised on TV and on billboards. As you went down the career ladder, some ambulances were advertised on the benches of bus stops. Raleigh Cruz had an expression on his face that looked like he was advertised in massage parlors and on the Fox News channel. Raleigh smiled rapaciously when Leroy handed him the business card that was in Kendall's divorce package. Soon the smile turned into a grimace. Solomon, Klein and Davis? What the fuck? I thought you said that your son-in-law is a mechanic. How can he afford a SKD on a mechanic salary? He owns several workshops, Leroy said. I don't think he's really working on cars. Raleigh rolled his eyes, deciding not to rely on his new clients for information. He turned to his computer and did a quick Google search for Dan Kinner from Kinner Automotive. 12 places. Not bad. It looks promising. His business has 12 branches. This should bring considerable benefits to your daughter in the divorce. Maybe we can get him to pay all my fees as well. Raleigh wasn't really rubbing his hands in anticipation, but it didn't take a lot of imagination to imagine how he was doing it. Go to hell. Raleigh looked at his cell phone in disbelief. He left a message for Dan's lawyer, Dwight Solomon, who finally answered his call. Raleigh demanded an immediate meeting with Dan Kinner and his lawyer to arrange temporary marital support. Dwight answered Raleigh and then disconnected the call. Raleigh immediately called Dwight Solomon back, intending to read him the riot act and teach him a lesson in professional courtesy towards fellow members of the legal profession. What part of the phrase "go to hell" did you not understand? Dwight Solomon asked without greeting or preamble. If you want to play hard, then we'll play hard, Raleigh told himself, putting his mobile phone on the table. Why didn't you tell me there was a video? Raleigh shouted at his customers. I look like an idiot in this conference room. Raleigh finally managed to get in touch with someone from Solomon, Klein and Davis. A first-year employee called Raleigh to schedule a pre-conference. Raleigh's clients were not supposed to attend this first conference. The whole conference was an unpleasant event for Raleigh. From the moment he entered the Escalation law office until he slipped out the door, it was one long attempt to embarrass and humiliate Roland Cruz, Esq. It all started when Raleigh walked into the waiting room and gave his name to the receptionist. He thought that if the dog shit left to dry on the sidewalk suddenly grew arms and legs, and it grabbed a briefcase and announced its intention to practice law, it would be received no less warmly than Raleigh. He was directed away from the waiting area to a small conference room and informed that he would be brought in soon. They will bring you. She actually said that he would be brought in, as if he were a stick that was thrown to a dog. Raleigh sat in the small room for 20 minutes before someone brought him in. Kid. Or at least she seemed to Raleigh like a kid barely out of high school. In fact, Lauren Davis was 32 years old. She graduated from Yale University Law School. Some might think that it was the fact that her father, Lawrence Davis, was the named partner that allowed Lauren to quickly get a partnership. They would have been mistaken. It was thanks to her inherited natural abilities and a penchant for law that she became a junior partner before her 30th birthday. Raleigh didn't know any of this. He just looked at Lauren and mentally waved her away. When Raleigh sat down in the large conference room, he was shocked that Lauren took the seat across from him. There was amusement in her eyes as Raleigh began to list his client's demands. As Raleigh listed the requirements, that amused look became more and more wolfish. They have recordings of your daughter attacking her husband. They have recordings of your daughter violating a restraining order and threatening to kill. They have recordings of you and your wife making death threats. They had a prenuptial agreement, which for some reason you forgot to mention to me. You made me look like a freshman student, not a man who has been practicing law for 30 years, Raleigh said bitterly. The whole thing was a humiliating experience for Raleigh, and he was furious. I'm firing you as clients. Go and find someone else to do your shit. And here's my bill for the wasted time. Now get out of my office. Kendall and her parents were looking at Dan from the conference room table. Kendall was dressed to the highest standard and knew she looked good. She wanted her husband to see what he was throwing away. Dan stared at Kendall in silence, ignoring her attempts to make him regret his decision to divorce her. They agreed to all the points of the divorce. There was nothing to share. Everyone would take what they married. Dan bought the house during his first marriage and retained ownership, since Kendall was never listed on the certificate. She didn't think Dan was completely committed to their marriage. Dan could see that his subconscious didn't fully trust Kendall. In the end, they were both right. As part of the divorce agreement, Dan demanded that Kendall return her engagement set to him, and he returned his engagement ring to her. She put the rings in an envelope and handed the envelope to Dan across the conference room. He didn't have an envelope, so he just took the ring off his finger and handed it across Kendall's desk, where it lay for the entire meeting. As they stood up, finishing the task that brought them together for the last time, Dan had a question for Kendall. Can you tell me why? You've had a good life. I know that you loved me, and I loved you. Why did you give up everything for an affair? Kendall sighed and looked up for a moment before looking at Dan. I don't know. Boredom? Restlessness? Increase my chances of promotion? Maybe all three. What do you want me to say, Dan? That I regret cheating on you? I regret that I was caught. I can't say that I regret cheating. I am who I am. But you were a good husband. I just haven't been a good wife. I do not know if I will ever be able to become a good wife. For anyone. Dan nodded. Kendall hadn't told him anything he didn't already know or guess about. Kendall gathered up her purse and documents and turned to leave. Kendall. She turned around and looked at Dan, who pointed to his wedding ring, which was still lying on the conference table. You should probably take this.